thank you to Rosa Kim for inviting me to participate in this wonderful seminar. And I want to thank all of you, as David did already, for taking a Saturday off to come and learn about Korean culture, Korean history, and listen to some really wonderful experts and authors, so thank you. One of the previous speakers wasn't here when she was introduced, but she mentioned that when you look at the standards for California, or for the nation on Korean history, it didn't come into the 11th and 12th grade. Children's literature is using picture books or other literature is an absolutely essential and amazing way to take the culture of a country and invite children from the age of kindergarten, first grade, all the way through high school. To be able to be introduced to that. And I think, when Hilda said, if there's a story out there, or if you know of a story, if you're thinking of a story, and it hasn't been told, then maybe you need to tell the story. And so I think that's really true with authors, and as it's worked for her, it certainly has worked for me too. So today I'm going to be talking, to talk about my inspiration, publication, and beyond. And when my editor, this is like right here, Good Fortune in a Wrapping Cloth, when she first described it in a blurb for advertising, she said Good Fortune in a Wrapping Cloth is a story of a young girl, Jae-soo, whose love and determination required her to learn a skill to be rejoined with her mother. And when I first read it, I thought, yes, Jae-soo did learn a skill and she was rejoined with her mother. But when she talked about the love and determination, I was sort of taken back and I thought, whoa, it really is in the story, but it's not something that I consciously wrote to put into the story. It just sort of came out organically. So we're going to look at the process of what I did to go through to write Good Fortune in a Wrapping Cloth. And the window. When we think of inspiration, it's just not the inspiration for the moment of that story, but I think inspiration from authors, for authors, goes back to their very beginning. And so this is a picture of my family. I'm sitting on my mother's lap. And when I look back at my family and what did they do that maybe helped to bring me to where I am? My mother was an artist, and she also was someone who was a very loving person. So those two components were there. My father was a very determined person. He held very high expectations for education and for whatever we did. From that, my sister is also an author, and my brother is a fabulous chef, and I just think that those components of family that you're rooted in really say something and help you move forward to someplace that you are. When I was young, we didn't have a lot of money. Books were not in abundance in our home, but the emphasis on education was. And so these are some of my favorite books when I was young. The Golden Egg book, Read Me Another Story, was one of my favorite. And I always think I ended, after my mother finished reading, I would say, read me another story, and they would. Mother Goose, Anne Anderson's fairy tales. So we have all of those books that at a young age really began the storytelling process. San Bernardino Public Library, I grew up not too far from here, and this was a place we didn't have the money to have books in the home, but my parents made sure that we went to the library and brought books home. And I know that as teachers, you know the importance of children reading, and I think it's a terrible shame that our libraries and schools their budgets have been cut so much, and so if you don't, if books aren't there, then it's going to be just so much harder for the students. So both public libraries and school libraries should be funded, as all of you know. I don't have to get on my soapbox for that. So this is the children's library, and I'd like to say a few years ago it looked like this, but I have to go back decades to say the children's section of the library is still by those wonderfully bright windows, and I just love that when I returned and saw that it still is inspiring children and letting light into their worlds. So when I first was inspired to write the story, I was at the San Francisco Asian Art Museum. And originally the art museum where it is located now, was a library. I just actually thought of that back there. I remember going there when it was a library. And there's a wonderful staircase going up to the second and third floors. And I started going up those marble stairs, and I turned to the right and went into the Korean exhibit. And I was absolutely amazed. I looked at these regular exhibit that had a lot of pottery and artwork, but then I turned the corner, and this is what I saw. You're going to see a series of these. These are the Korean bojangis. They are handmade. All of these, except for one that I'll tell you about, were antique. So these old bojangis, as I looked at them, and they varied in size from about like this to probably the size of the one that is up there. And the colors, the shapes, the designs absolutely drew me in. They were so gorgeous. And when I looked up close at them and saw the way the corners and the edges of the fabric met, I looked at the almost invisible stitching in each one. It was absolutely amazing. And over in the corner, there was a contemporary one by a woman whose name was Chung-Hee. And does anybody know her? Familiar with her? Well, I wasn't either, but I got to know her quite well. But hers was very special because it had 3 layers of fabric, and silk screened on the fabric were old photographs of Korean women. And she dedicated this. She actually had a whole series of bojangis that she did, and that they were dedicated to the anonymous women who stitched these bojangis, because they never signed them. And if any of you have sewn or tried to sew something as intricate and fabulous as this, you know the amount of time that it would take to do it. So she had dedicated this. Well, when I first started doing my research, and when I saw that, I was inspired. I saw those pictures of those women, and I thought, their story has to be told. So I'm going to go back to you. The story isn't told, so I had to tell it. It was almost like the women were tapping me on the shoulder, and I tried to shake it off a little bit, and they were over on this shoulder. And so I went online, Googled, and right away, kind of at the top, Chung-Hee Lee's name came up. And I noticed she was at the Rhode Island School of Design. This is a number of years ago. You know, I really wasn't thinking of the etiquette and the proper way that you go about meeting someone. I noticed Rhode Island School of Design. I picked up the phone, and I said, I'd like to speak to Chung-Hee Lee. There she was at the other end of the phone, and I just thought she was like kind of ordinary. I mean, I just didn't know. Afterwards, I found out that she's a world-known fiber artist. She has work at the Albert, the Victoria Museum in London, in MoMA in New York, in South Africa, in Seoul, in all over the world. And as we got to be really friends as we went through this, one day she said, Joan, she said, I would like to write a book on bojangi also. And she said, wouldn't it be wonderful if someday we could sign our book together? It's like, that would be very nice. So let's go back and look at these bojangis for a minute. I want you to notice in this one, all of the different shapes. You're going to see squares and rectangles and triangles and trapezoids and all different types of fabric. When they would sew them, they would use the same type of fabric. There will all be cotton, rainy, silk, because the fabrics have to match in their texture, so there's not puckering, and they can be very smooth. And you'll notice in some of the fabrics in this, if not all of them, have a design. So it's sort of a design within a design. On this one, you'll see that they've just taken a simple combination of squares and rectangles and built upon that. And in the center, you'll see that there's a little tab. And this bojangis have many uses, and I'll talk about those in a minute. But this one would be used to put over maybe a plate of food or even a dish of food. And that tab in the center would be just pulled up like this. So you'd see that, you know, when you think back of that wonderful box of desserts that looks so wonderful, that were wonderful today, that's just a perfect example of pulling the cloth up and displaying what's underneath. This one is just one of my favorites too. So now we have just one color and lots of different shapes. The tabs on the straps on the side, this particular bojangi most likely was used to cover a table. So if they prepared food in the kitchen and they were going to carry it into another part of the house, they would cover that, use those tabs to tie on the legs of the table. And then when it was ready, they simply would untie it and pull it off. All of the ones that I'm showing you are very fine, light fabrics. These would most likely be used in the summer, but in the winter, when the food needed to be kept hot, they would use actually quilted fabrics, and that would help to keep the food warm. But again, you can see just the simplicity of color. This one I really enjoyed because you have just a fabulous intricacy of design in the center, and then a simple border of colors around the outside. These are often compared to Klee's work, the artist Klee, because we're looking at modern designs and wonderful colors. On this one, you look at all of the rectangles and squares, and there isn't one set of squares that has the same color matching. So these women, when they would begin designing these, they would actually make a pattern and, you know, think out the way that they're going to plan it. When we look at the bojagis that were made by the common folk, and I'll talk a little bit more about that, they used scraps of fabric. For the ones that were done for royalty, then they would obviously use finer fabrics and usually silks. Again, just a beautiful combination of different designs and shapes. This one is a contemporary bojagi, and you can see just the colors and the stitching. But I want to show you real quickly. In many of these, especially the old ones, when they are stitched, each seam is stitched in 3 different ways. I think my voice will be loud enough for just one. So the first thing they did was stitch a seam like this. And I've done very large running stitches so you can see the way it's stitched. But then you have this real raw edge and it doesn't look very good. So then they went over and they turned the fabric kind of inside out and stitched it again. So now it looks nicer, feels nicer, but it flops. It's going to flop back and forth. So then they did stitched it a 3rd time, and they stitched it down, so now you have a flat seam. I always knew this as a French seam, but it also could be a Korean seam now. So you can see the intricacies of that. So when you look at this, it's not just stitching one seam at a time, but it's stitching one seam 3 times. This one, again, was probably the size of that screen too. Beautiful pastels. So you can see that sometimes they used contrasting colors and sometimes they did complementary colors on these. So when we talk about research, Wrappings of Happiness was actually the exhibit that I saw. So a lot of these bojagis are in this book. And I learned a tremendous amount, first just of the bojagis, and Bojagi and Beyond is the book that Chunky Lee finished, and we did have a signing together. So let's look at what are some things that I learned about the bojagi. First, a bog means a wrapping cloth or good luck. So the really wonderful thing, when someone is stitching, I'm sure all of you at some point have given a gift to someone for Christmas, for a birthday, an anniversary, or maybe just because you really liked them. And you don't just get any old thing for them, but you think of something that they like, something they might be interested in, something that's special for them. Well, when these women were sewing the bojagi, they thought of that too. And as they stitched, there was an old folk belief that as they stitched blessings of happiness, good health, and good fortune. And so each, I can't say with every stitch, but as they did it, they would think giving that gift of happiness, good luck, and good fortune to them. And so they said that the women wish the recipients of their bojagi good luck and happiness. It's a common folk belief that something made with care is said to have good luck. And connecting small pieces of cloth together was associated with long life. During this time period, it was about 1,000 years that these bojagis had been made, and the women were very, very frugal in Korea, probably everywhere. But they would take the scraps of fabric, and they didn't want to throw anything away, so that's when stitching these bojagis became very important. carrying things with bojagis are absolutely the easiest thing. It must be like 5 pounds a year. This is an example of a bojagi, and it's really heavy. And as it is unwrapped, this is something that you might find in a Korean, if you just want to sit down, maybe that first too. This is something you might find in a Korean home. It's simply going to be a basket or a bowl of fabrics, and these would be scraps that then she would take them and begin matching the colors. You'll notice that some are very light colors, so these fabrics are going to be stitched together, and sturdier fabrics. Now, for the royalty, they're going to be using the finer fabrics and the silks and those wonderful things, but the bojagi that are made for everyday use are going to be out of heavy fabric. So there were many different uses for the bojagi. So fabric should be the same thickness or texture. They used fine silk, cotton, ramie, and hemp. Different kinds of bojagi. The kangpo were used for royalty and the wealthy. And they often used, the colors they used were pink, red, or purple. Silk is what was often used. And these bojagis would be commissioned. So these would be for birthdays, and weddings, and New Year's Day. And if I want you to think for a minute, at this time, everything was sewn by hand. So if you were a king, or if you were in the Yangbang families that were very wealthy, you would have to have a whole slew of women who would be sewing for you, because they'd have to make all of your clothes. They'd have to make all of the bojagi that would, cover food, that you'd wrap jewelry in or cover bedding with. So there were many, many needs for this. So they would go out into the countryside, a Sangwain master would go out into the countryside looking for a seamstress that they could then employ. And that woman would live for the rest of her life with that family. There were 273 uses for bojagi in King Yeongjo's palace in the 1700s. So just think of all the different ways and the different styles and colors that must have been used at that time. Women also, obviously would not just be hired to sew the bojagi, but they would also be hired to sew whatever the sewing needs were in the palace. Then you have the minpo, which would be what the commoners would sew. And these are the women that I'm talking about who are looking at the scraps of fabric that they're going to be creating things for their household. And they would be used to carry things. They would be used to carry persimmons to the market. They would be used to carry grains from one place to another. It would be used to carry a child on your back. I mean, these are the most versatile, these wrapping cloths are the most versatile and useful jewels there are. And they'd also use them as food coverings, and they were often brightly colored, as we noticed in the first ones that I showed you. There also is another kind called a subo, which I didn't, in the book, my illustrator included it as one of the final bojagis that Jesu made. And those were used for special occasions and weddings, and they often would wrap a wooden goose in it for the wedding day that the bridegroom would then give to the bride's family. And the motifs on those were often, they drew from nature. So you'd look at trees, fruits, butterflies, and birds. So, now we're going to sort of step into the manuscript component. When I first started writing this, when you write a book, you really kind of need to think of who your audience is going to be and what the length is. So I just started writing, and I kept vacillating because of the beautiful bojagi. I wanted it to be a picture book because I thought I wanted those illustrations to be shared, and yet I kept writing more and more and more characters in the stories. And so at one point, I had to make a decision of whether it was going to be a chapter book for young readers or whether it was going to be a picture book. And so I decided on a picture book, and probably my first draft was about 3,200 words. Right now, if I was going to be submitting a picture book, they wouldn't want anything over 800 words. So I knew I had to cut it back. So I cut it down and got it down to about 2,300 words, submitted it to my publisher, and she said, I really love this, but you have to cut it by a third. I can't. I didn't tell her that. I just couldn't imagine cutting more out. But when she said she would publish it, I found a way to cut that many more out. And so this is just an example of one page and the amount of editing, and authors edit and edit and edit. All authors do. So I just wanted to show you that process. When we talk about other places for research, Young Min Lee has done, and this is a wonderful video on bojagi, how to make them, and it's just so thorough. And we have done a couple workshops together. She's really amazing. So once my manuscript was accepted, I asked my editor, well, who are you thinking of for an illustration? I said, what kind of illustrations are you thinking of? And she said, you don't have any say. People are always surprised at that as a writer, you can write a book, but unless you are the illustrator, which I am not, you have no say. And they usually like to take a new author and a well-established illustrator, or the other way around. So somebody's name, the illustrator's name would pull the author along, or vice versa. So she finally called me and she said, of course, if you know children's books, I'm sure all of you have read lots of them over time, there's so many different styles. This is the style I wanted. This is the watercolor that Jessica Lannon submitted to Shen's books. And when I saw this, I thought, it's going to be perfect, that she's going to do exactly what I wanted. The interesting thing was after, and you don't talk to the illustrator at all until the book is published. So, but at one point she called and wanted to know, they said, this takes place in the 1700s, right? I said, yes. So that was the only question she asked that I could answer. So when we first talked, after it's all published, she said, are you a Korean scholar? And I said, not at all. She said, you really made me work to make this authentic. And I think she did an absolutely amazing job with this. So, I mentioned Chunji Lee. She wrote Bojagi and Beyond. At one point she said, I'd like to, early on she said, I'd like to sign with you. And my book came out in June, and I Googled her or contacted her to tell her the book was out, and she said, I'm having a signing in San Francisco, why don't you come? And so we went up, it was at the Museum of Crafts and Folk Art, and it was absolutely wonderful for the two of us to be signing. And some of this was work of hers, and some of it was work that her students had done. So she's just a wonderful, wonderful person. And these are just some examples from that. This is a contemporary bojagi. When we talked about the embroidered ones, the two at the bottom show the embroidery, which take a tremendous amount of work also. This one was larger than this screen. All the stitching, the intricacy is absolutely amazing. So you can see where and why I was inspired to write this story. So, good fortune in a wrapping cloth. When I first, no, I'll say that for a minute. Let me, so when I mentioned that Jessica asked about me being a scholar, and the amount of research that she had to do for the story was really amazing. A reader, it doesn't matter, the two of us could sit down and read a story, a manuscript without illustrations, and we are going to bring our prior knowledge to the story. We're going to read it a little bit differently for whatever reason. So when I looked at what Jessica pulled out of the story, it was just amazing to me. Just subtle things that all of her experience, her artistic creativity, brought a tremendous meaning to my text and really made my story come to life. So I can't take the credit at all for all of this. I really have to walk hand in hand with Jessica on this. So you can see this is the first page, and right away you get a feeling for the setting. You get a feeling for the time period, the clothing that the people are wearing, and I love this. Next picture. With this one, she said, Joan, this one was probably the hardest picture to illustrate. She said, I kept trying to, in the story, let me read the words here, and then I'll go back to it. Amma, listen, horses. Jesu pressed closer to her mother. Stay, don't go to King Youngjo's court. It is an honor for me and our family to sew bojagi for the royal household. Amma told her again, the Sanguian master searches for the finest seamstresses. He saw one of my bojagi at the market, and he chose me. I must go. So right here, the mother is leaving, and she's going to be, she's handing, you see the bojagi, the wrap, a gift that she's going to give her daughter. So she said, I kept trying different ways, and she said, I had a friend came over, and she happens to have adopted a daughter from Korea that was like 8 years old. And so she said to them, what would you do? How would you say goodbye if you knew you were never going to see each other again? This is the posture, the embrace that they did. And she said, that's it. So I thought that was really pretty neat. So in the story, her mother is gone. Her mother has left her a box. With young children, I use a lot of realia. This is not at all what the Korean box looks like. But inside, there are 7 close companions. And so, you would have a needle, thread, a ruler, scissors, a thimble, and actually 2 irons, one called a Jarimi and one called an Indo, that would be used for making sure that these seams were very flat before you went on. And so now her mother's not there. And Jesu wants to learn how to sew bojagi well enough so she can be rejoined with her mother. So she asked her great aunt Homo if she's going to help. And she said yes. And this is another surprise in my story because in my mind, if I was doing the illustrations, and I'm sure I didn't, I would have Homo in the background, but not Jessica. As you go through the story, you see she's right up there in front. She's the person who stands by her, which is really quite wonderful. She also put in, you'll see the little black cat there, and I asked Jessica if she had cats, because I didn't write anything about a cat in the story. She said no, but she said, I felt that she needed to have someone next to her that was non-judgmental, that was just going to be there with her throughout the story. And so you'll see on a number of pages this wonderful cat that is right by her side. And again, you can see the different, the mother's close sewing companions that are there with her. So her aunt says, yes, collect the different bojagis that are in the house and bring them to me. So she gathered one from Buddha's altar, and she gathered them from the kitchen, and she gathered them from the courtyard. And she had her look at the different textures, the different designs, and the different colors, so that all of those components were going to be important to her. It says, Jesu chose pomegranate red and pine green. She remembered how long and crooked her stitches were when she was only 6 and first learning to sew by following Amma's basting threads. Now Jesu ripped out what she had sewn and practiced with smaller and more even stitches while Gomo quietly chanted. After many weeks, Jesu held up her first bojagi for Gomo to see. I made this all myself. So you can see the amount of work and how dedicated she was. Hibiscus bloomed in the garden, spring turned to summer. Jesu's cousins played while Jesu worked on the bojagi with the colors of summer fruit, peach, plum, and cherries. Each tiny stitch felt like it was a step closer to Uma. This one is, I think, I have 2 favorite pages, and this is one of them. You'll notice in your book this is actually a double spread, and I'll show you the next picture. It's my favorite picture in the book too. In autumn, Jesu's girl cousins played on the swing. Once she left her sewing to join them, hoping to see the trees on the other side of the wall, instead of just the crowns of the trees like mushrooms peeking over the fence. Jesu secretly promised herself to see what was beyond the wall someday. Gold and orange leaves danced in the wind, and Jesu dreamed of the colors lining the path to Uma. So this is the picture opposite that page. And so Jesu, bats are a sign of good luck. in Korean culture, so she wanted to send a bojagi to her mother. And she knew that her cousin was going to be taking some pomegranates to the palace. So she sewed a bojagi for her to give to her mother, and hoping that her mother would send one back so she would know that there's like sending a letter, but they were going to trade bojagis. But her cousin came back empty-handed. So there was no bojagi with that. And then her cousin came back and said, the Sanguine master is going to be here, and he's going to be looking for other seamstresses. And so she said, I'm going to make a bojagi to show the Sanguine master. It must be your finest, Gomo said. Jesu fit odd-shaped pieces of rainy together like a puzzle. She made every stitch tight and perfect. The bojagi grew along with her dream of being with Uma again. And when the full moon rose, Jesu hurried to attach a bat. And there you can see the cat in the background. This is the Sanguine master. She's presenting her bojagi. And he says, this is really fine. This is wonderful. He turns to his aide and says, is there more by this woman? And Jesu bows and she says, yes, I have more. And she went back into their house and pulled all of hers up and brought them out to him. But what she failed to realize was when she grabbed that whole stack, she brought the ones that, her very first ones, that had crooked seams and uncut threads. And so when the Sanguine master saw them, he just tossed them on the ground. He said, these aren't good enough. And Jesu returned, backed up, and Gomo said, everybody needs to start at the beginning. And so she prepared her favorite foods for her. Nothing comforted her. It was very, very difficult for her. But then, the next morning, the Sanguine master came back and he said, if you can sew a bojagi as fine as the one you first showed me, when I come back for the Dano festival, I will look at it. And so Jesu started again. And she worked very, very hard. When her cousins played outside, she remained inside. At one point, she pricked her finger with a needle and blood was on the cloth and she had to rip it out and stitch it again. And then, right before the Dano festival, they heard horses outside and her aunt came running and said, bring your bojagi. And she did. And she showed it to the Sanguine master and he says, you've been chosen, be ready at sunrise. And the next morning, quick goodbyes to aunts and cousins felt like clipping threads. Jesu tied her few possessions into her largest bojagi. She saved the one she made for Amma to give her. Jesu handed Gomo the last one. Thank you for all you taught me. It was an honor, and Gomo held Jesu close. Now you will be with Amma. In a small palace courtyard, Jesu saw a woman's shadow and the door slid open. Amma, Jesu hurried to her. My dear daughter, Amma and Jesu held each other like threads in a seam. Jesu opened her bojagi. Amma examined it. Each stitch has brought us together again. Jesu nodded. Good fortune is in a wrapping cloth. And so this, and when they say that good fortune is in a wrapping cloth, when I first, I taught children's literature and reading and writing for years, and my students would always have to write a book. And I had these little gold stickers that I would put on their best story of the year. Well, when I got mine, I put a little gold sticker on it because I really wanted to pretend I won some great award, like a Caldecott or something. And then, a year later, I received a phone call from my editor, and I received the Asian Pacific American Award for the best picture book for that year. And to me, that was just really it was very, very exciting because it really meant that my book was going to make a step forward into the world of Korean literature. So I was very, very pleased with that. So let's go on. The question often comes to, now I've published the book, received recognition for it, but then where does it take you? Well, it brings me to places like this, where I'm sharing the story with some really wonderful teachers and educators and professionals in other fields, And hopefully you'll take that story and share it with your children and yours, all of your students. It's kind of interesting that I even got here because I was right in a master's program. I have a master's in literacy. And I was 2/3 of the way finished. I went in, my next class was a writing class. And the instructor said, now in this writing class, it's going to be divided into 2 different sections. One is learning what you need to teach children to be good writers. Not a problem, I can do that. The second is you're going to have to write a story and share it with a group, a little literature group, or a writing group. And this knot started turning in my stomach. By the time I got home, I walked into the house and I said to my husband, in absolute all honesty, I said, I can't complete this program. I said, I'm supposed to write a story and share it with someone else. Never in my life, and my youngest was 10, so I wasn't 22 years old. I said, I have never written something and read it to someone else. So my challenge to all of you, if you are in literature, in writing, whatever, make sure that you give your students those opportunities to write and share. So I also worked in elementary school, so I started right then with children in kindergarten, writing and sharing their stories. So none of them would ever get to be as old as I was and having that pit in their stomach to have to share. And that I think is kind of ironic because I wrote a story. But so anyway, I think that's really important. I've had opportunities. Part of my research too was going to different museums, going to Korean museums, or Asian museums, or Korean museums to learn more about that. And this is a Korean hat. You probably know a lot of this, so I'll just sort of go through it rather quickly. This is the game of Yut, a game that is mentioned in the story that is often played on New Year's. This is a Korean chair. In the Lyman Museum in Hawaii, they have a Korean village. It's like a Korean home. It's even more than a home. It's like 2 or 3 homes. So I had the opportunity to step in and really see shoes left outside. This is actually the kind of box instead of this that would be a sewing box, and you can see that there's a little information sheet about it. And the kitchen, and if you look at the kitchen and that Jessica illustrated, very, very similar to this. And I thought it was interesting because in these rooms are simple, there's not a lot of decoration in it, but the things that they had, that sewing box with 7 companions, trunks, obviously a bed, but I also love the fact that writing is very important. And you can see there was a small table with a book with Korean writing. This is a wall, not a wall hanging, a wall shelf that they would put the paper in. And I love this. I love the brushes. So I thought that when we looked at the components that you would see in a home, the fact that there would be a sewing box was pretty important. Korean Museum in San Francisco, this is where it all began, if you remember. And this was the first place that outside of a launch party in my hometown, the Asian Art Museum asked me to come and present. And so I put my little bojaги out in front. And this is the room that I gave my first presentation in, which was absolutely amazing. It was given to adults and children. And it was for a special Korean day. So they had wonderful music. And I'll stop here for a minute. When I was first doing some of my research, I wasn't invited, I sort of crashed a party at a church where they were having a Korean celebration. And when I went in, I truly was one of the few non-Koreans. And this family came over and just welcomed me to sit around at their table. And he happened to be work at the same university, a professor at the same university where I worked. And we started talking, and they asked me what I was doing. I told them about my book, and they said, we'd like to hear it. And I said, well, it's not a book yet, it's just a manuscript. And the mother said, well, please come to my home. I want you to read it to my children. So I did. And so when she opened the door, she was dressed just as beautifully as you are today, wonderful traditional Korean clothing, and so were her 2 daughters. And we went in and I sat down on a chair and they both sat on the ground and somehow those skirts just billow out so beautifully. I mean, it was just, it's so memorable in my mind. And as I sat and read the story, her mother, it wasn't this one, it was still in the rough form, and her mother just kept nodding, nodding. So I knew by her nods that I was getting things right. And that was early on in the story too, so that was great. At the Asian Art Museum, the students, not only there, but in classrooms really across the United States, I've received pictures from teachers who are taking the book and incorporating it across the curriculum into art projects. And actually, if you go on my website, there's lesson plans for young children and then up through high school too. So this is an example. This was actually the Asian Art Museum. These are some thimbles by young Min Lee. Okay. So this one is done in a kindergarten. We read the story and we took little, the little Post-its. So we took different colors and I showed them all different kinds of bojagi. And then they took we cut some of the squares into triangles. And these are, aren't they, I just think they're wonderful. The patterns of colors that they came, it didn't matter, there were some white spaces, but they get a feeling for shapes and geometry and creativity. One of the first schools that contacted me was a 6th grade class, and I Skyped with the teacher, and I said, I noticed they're all boys in your class. She said, well, the girls are out for their sex ed, so we have all the boys. And she said, I'm doing this art project with them, and they had done a block print of themselves, and then they were going to wrap this as a Christmas gift for their mothers. These boys were as into the stitching as any of the girls were. And this particular teacher does art from 2nd grade up through high school. So I had an opportunity to Skype with 2nd graders and 6th graders and high school students. So the book really has taken a life of its own and moved on in that way. This was a kit of bojagi. And this is just a treasure. A couple of years ago, the Getty Museum in Los Angeles was having a Korean exhibit, and they contacted me and said that my book was going to be at the bookstore during the exhibit. Would I want to come down and sign? And so then, about a year ago, I saw that the Los Angeles County Museum of Modern Art was having a Korean exhibit. So I called them and I said, I have this book, and they said, oh, we know your book. In fact, you need to come down because in our children's gallery, it's called the Boone Gallery, we are using your book as a springboard to create a bojagi. The Boone Gallery is where parents and children come in and they work on projects that relate to art in the museum. This is a 16 foot by 16 foot bojagi that the community had put together from January to the end of June. And so I went down, of course, I had a conference to go to in August, thinking it would be up, and I said, oh, where is it? And she said, oh, it's going to be here in September. So I said, well, how long is it going to be up? Because I want to make sure I go down to see it. And I said, a few weeks, and she said, oh no, don't worry, it'll be up for years. And I thought, well, that's just really a great experience for me to see a bojagi. Whether it was inspired by my book or my book is tying in with it in some way, I think it's just really exciting. So that's sort of my beyond piece. Besides meeting absolutely fabulous Korean people throughout the state and beyond. So I've been very, very lucky. It's been a wonderful journey, and truly the story has good luck in a wrapping cloth. So, thank you. And I'm going to show you just real quickly. I'll take away my books. How to wrap in a wrapping cloth. So, excuse me. You often see that they have different colors, and this one is silk. So, just use just one. So you're going to take this, and there are many ways. I'll show you about 3 different ways. So you just simply pull up the sides like this, And okay.
Use rubber band first.
Yeah, use just a rubber band. So
and just decorate it.
Right. So this band is going to go around like this. It's going to be decorated like this, but I have to show you. I'll let you pretend you're putting, or you can put that on. But let me show you. All right, so I have this little, my little grandchildren, and so I'm really into reusable wrapping, reusable whatever. So I found inexpensive Christmas wrapping, and so I wrote their little names. So every year, this is what their gift goes in. So it says here, to Josephine from Mom and Papa. So let me see, which one was I going to do? This. So you simply wrap tuck it in like this, fold this side around and fold it back so you have, you see the other color, like this, and then take these sides and you're just going to twist. Twist and twist and twist. And tie a little hoop. Tie a little knot up here. And it just comes as a great little carrier. And the wonderful thing is, I mean, it doesn't matter what size the gift is, there are just wonderful ways of wrapping it. And if you go online, or even if you look at Young Min's, if you look at her website, you'll find lots of other ways to wrap your joggers. So, a couple different ways. So, oh, sure. This wrapping cloth, we'll say the book in it too, as long as it's all wrapped. Right. When women stitched the bojagi, what were the meanings of the stitches?
It's a quiz.
She's
going to give out the prizes.
And this is the prize. Whoever, yes.
What is that?
What were the three ideas or stitches, the reason they stitched the bojagis? So you said,
Afternoon after.
I know, I'm sure you're just one. Oh, yeah.
Good luck, good health, good fortune.
Very good.
Ben, you won them.
Thank you, and thank all of you for coming today, and please take all that you're learning from all of us back to your students.